Well, as you can see, we're back riding the Sugar House trolley. When last we were on here tracking the railroads of John Young, I said we would pick up in this show talking about the radio factory of Nathaniel Baldwin, Baldwin Radio. You see, I have a map showing that Nathaniel Baldwin had a radio shop here in Sugar House, except his factory was a couple of miles east of here on 23rd East. However, this map is from 1950, which is after he got out of federal prison.
Prison?
Yeah. So actually we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here with the story. So let's go back to the beginning and pick it up from there, where it actually makes a good deal more sense. So Nathaniel Baldwin was actually born in Fillmore in central Utah. I think you're quite familiar with central Utah. She's from there. Yeah, she's from there.
Right.
So she knows Fillmore quite well. And it's a small little community, not a lot of people down there, and that will be coming back as a feature here. But at any rate, he decided that he wanted to study physics and science, so he walked all the way from Fillmore to Provo, which is a distance.
A distance, sure.
It's a distance to attend Brigham Young Academy, which is now Brigham Young University, where he studied physics. And then he left there and he went to Stanford, where he got 2 advanced degrees. Now, I don't think he walked this time, because that would be a distance to walk to the Bay Area from now. So that wouldn't. But he got 2 advanced degrees, came back to Brigham Young Academy, now Brigham Young University, where he taught. And he taught physics and science at Brigham Young Academy. So that was really cool. Now you have to understand a little of the history of the Mormon Church for this next bit to make any sense. But the Mormons, of course, were polygamists from the earliest days. And this had created no end of grief and problems for them. And in fact, thousands of people had died supporting polygamy, because it quite often turned into an actual shooting war between people over this divisive issue. But in 1890, the church came out and said, we disavow polygamy. We're not going to allow it anymore. And we won't be engaging in any more plural marriages. And they were even sort of encouraging people who had plural wives to work that out somehow so that they wouldn't have plural wives. Well, Nathaniel Baldwin was outraged. It's like, how can the church just walk away from this major principle of salvation that they had been touting for the longest time and just say, well, we're not going to do that anymore? So he wrote articles, and he was very outspoken against the new move, and a lot of the other members were similarly very outspoken, so much so that they got excommunicated.
Oh my.
But Nathaniel Baldwin didn't get excommunicated, but they did fire him from BYU as a little retribution for his support of polygamy when they were coming out against polygamy. And so this forced him to take some rather menial jobs. He ended up working at a power plant near Heber on the Snake Creek, where they were generating hydroelectric power, which was very interesting to him as a scientist, but nevertheless, it was just a very menial job generating power for the mining industry. And then they transferred him to Mill Creek Canyon, to a power station there, where they were generating electricity for Salt Lake City, because Mill Creek Canyon is in the Salt Lake City area. So the upside of all that is he had a lot of free time on his hands, and he had an air compressor at his disposal. There were not a lot of air compressors around back then, and he had one because they had one at the power plant. They helped run the power plant somehow. So he was experimenting with the air compressor. Now, according to him, his motivation was that you couldn't hear the speakers at the semi-annual conference in the tabernacle, and he wanted to build an audio amplifier that they could use in the tabernacle to amplify the voice of the speakers. So he took his air compressor and he filled a tank with compressed air, and he rigged a diaphragm on that, and you would yell into the diaphragm, and that would work a valve that would let air out of the tank, and that would release the air through a big cone. And I'll be damned if it didn't actually work. It amplified his voice, and so he tested it there in Mill Creek Canyon, and it worked rather well.
Mill Creek is a beautiful little canyon, and people from Salt Lake have always enjoyed going up there. And how shocked some of them must have been to hear this amplified voice when nobody ever heard an amplified sound. I like to think Baldwin read scripture, since that's what he designed the thing to do.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff comfort me. And if this invention works, I'm moving the hell out of this canyon.
Well, anyway, Baldwin switched over to the idea of electronic amplification instead of pneumatic amplification, because hauling around the air compressor, it was a little cumbersome. And there was a lot of advances in electronics at the time, radio equipment coming out and other things. So he quickly started to experiment with vacuum tubes and electronic amplification and playing around with radios. There was the Marconi radio, which was becoming quite popular. And he was trying to amplify the Marconi radio and make that louder so he could play it through a speaker. But what he did find is that he could take some little tiny, very efficient speakers and stick one up against each ear and hook them to the Marconi, and he didn't need an amplifier. He could hear what was going on really well because he had these very sensitive speakers shoved into his ears. And he thought, I think there's a product here. I think I can market this thing. So he rigged a headband. He tried to patent it, but the patent office said, are you nuts? You can't patent sticking speakers in your ear. And he tried to sell it to some people who said, are you nuts? You're just sticking speakers in your ears. That doesn't really, we don't know. Not interested. But the Navy said, you know what, this could really work for us, because on board the ship nobody can hear the Marconi. Can you whip up a couple hundred of these things and we'll stick them on ships? So, well, he did. He started building headphones, and that meant that he had to move out of Mill Creek Canyon, and he built a little wooden shack on some land just down from there, still right on Mill Creek. Generated his own electricity because he was into hydroelectric. So he built a paddle wheel and his own little hydroelectric station there on the stream, put up a little wood shack, hired a few people, and they started building headphones, which he called Baldies. Baldies after Baldwin. Baldies,
okay, got you.
Baldies. And orders just came flooding in. The Navy fell in love with them. Then all of the ships had to have them, and other governments had to have them. Everybody had to have Baldies for their radio operator.
Oh, wow.
And pretty soon just your garden variety radio enthusiast had to have some Baldies so that they could play with their shortwave radio or whatever.
Absolutely.
So it really took off. So he hired more people. He built another wooden shack. He had to increase the power output on his paddle wheel. And this was working out really well till the wood shacks burned down. So he built brick. It's like the story of the three little pigs. So he built a brick building, and then he started to enlarge that and hiring more employees and more employees. Finally ended up with 150 employees and sales of over $2 million a year in other associated electronic gear, but mostly headphones that he was building in his factory there, which was on Mill Creek, but at 23rd East. So just down from where he had been and just east of Sugar House, which is where this trolley goes. So that was pretty darn cool. Now he was doing so well with that he decided that on the same land he would build himself a really nice house.
Of course.
A beautiful house.
Why not?
And the house is still there.
Is it?
This is the house. We're looking at the house. And it's right where the power generating plant was, because he couldn't generate electricity fast enough anymore to make that work. So he kind of abandoned that, started buying electricity off the grid, which you could easily do at that point, and built this really nice house. Now, he had all of these polygamous friends from the earlier days, and one of the things that he would do is if a polygamist got fired from their job for being a polygamist, or if they got excommunicated from the church or whatever, he would give them a job in the factory. So much so that there was a rumor going around that said, if you're going to work for Baldwin, you have to be a polygamist. It's required. He won't give you a job unless you're a polygamist, which is not true.
No,
but there were a lot of polygamists working in the factory. And when these people would come to him, he would not only give them a job, he'd pay off all their bills.
Nice.
And for 12 of these people, he built them houses too. So right across the street from his really pretty house, he built these little modest bungalows. And he put 12 different families up in these little bungalows right across the street from his own house, because he really supported the polygamists and he thought that they were getting a raw deal.
I see.
So that was pretty cool that he would do that for these people. It didn't endear him with the church at all.
Not.
And they started to refer to his street as Polygamist Alley.
Oh.
And they were not terribly keen on the whole thing.
Now, along with the headphones that Baldwin was building, he started manufacturing high-fidelity speakers that you could hook to your radio or even to your phonograph. This was really cool. Now, my grandfather had this table, has a speaker built into it, and you can set your radio system on top of it and then hook it up to the speaker. He also made some of his own radios, big cabinet radios. And he had this really cool electronic tone arm that you could hook to your existing Victrola or Edison. Well, the Radio Factory still exists. It's kind of become a little artist's community, artist's mall, whatever you want to call it. It's got a nifty little antique store and a restaurant in it, and it looks a lot today the way it did when it was back working as a radio factory. This is Kevin Flynn, and he owns it now. He's a sax man, jazz player, cool guy. He's got his own studio here, and he has his own collection of Baldwin speakers, which makes a good deal of sense, doesn't it? He's got Baldy headphones in his collection and a bunch of just really cool stuff that he's collected. But it's really a fun place to go hang out at. This is the Old Flamingo. It's kind of a little antique-y store, boutique-y kind of store. It's really fun and cool. There's also just a really, really cool restaurant in here. But principally, the building is used for art galleries and art studios. There are dozens of artists who maintain studio space in here, and a lot of them have their own gallery as well. They have an annual art walk here, and you can come and walk through all of the galleries and studios and buy art and meet the artists and just sort of hang out. They have some good jazz, of course. You know, I've always felt like this kind of art is really very much like building model railroads. I mean, creativity is creativity, isn't it? And really, when you get right down to it, it's all just different forms of massive screwing around.
So, because Baldwin had been providing money to all of his polygamist friends, he went bust.
Of course.
In spite of the fact he was making all this money, he went broke. But what really bankrupted his company didn't have anything to do with giving all his money away. He was making money way too fast for that.
Right.
It was the success of the company that bankrupted the company.
And that figures.
And that it happens. He had to build another factory in Chicago, and then he built a factory in Hong Kong. Hello. All of this costs a lot of money, and this was draining his resources, and then you've got to grow exponentially to cover all that, and it just went bust. It got too big and too successful for its too big too fast, and that bankrupted the whole thing. Fortunately, Baldwin's friends, his polygamous friends, came to the rescue and they bailed him out.
Of course.
Now, they didn't have any money,
No,
but what they did have was a scheme for selling fraudulent stock out of the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, gee.
And Baldwin went along with this, which is how he ended up in federal prison after he was
how that happened.
convicted of mail fraud and securities violations and so on over the whole thing. And I don't know how many of the polygamists also got convicted, but I think some
One
of
or
them
two.
did as well. But for the most part, they just went on and
On their merry way.
did their own thing
Did
and
their own
left
thing.
him holding the bag. So it is interesting to note that after he went to prison and the polygamists kind of left their little houses and the whole thing went financially bust,
Right.
they founded their own church.
Yes, they did.
And they call that today the FLDS Church, the Fundamentalist LDS Church.
Right.
And you've probably heard about that because it's been in the news a lot
Yes, it
lately
has.
because their leader, Warren Jeffs, has been convicted of arranging child marriages. He made it all the way to the FBI's 10 most wanted
Yes,
list.
he did.
And it's been a huge, huge scandal
Yes, it has.
about that whole thing. And these are the same guys that lived in the little bungalows that were built for them by Baldwin at the radio factory. So, oh dear, oh dear.
Yeah.
But in a more cheerful note, some of the other ex-employees of the factory went on and did some really amazing things.
Oh, they did?
One of the most amazing was James B. Lansing.
Okay.
Now, he really loved the idea of building these hi-fi speakers,
Oh.
which they had been building at the radio factory, and went on and designed and started building his own hi-fi speakers. And then his company was acquired kind of hostilely by the Altec Corporation, and they turned that into Altec Lansing, and they built huge industrial sound systems for theaters and
Right,
concert
right.
venues and that sort of thing. And they still do to this day manufacture that equipment, and it's
Right.
still Altec Lansing.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. But James B., once he had a contractual obligation to work with them for 5 years,
Right.
and at the end of the 5 years he said, hasta la vista, people, I'm going to go do my own thing, and he started another company, JBL,
Okay.
for James B. Lansing,
Right.
making high-fidelity speakers,
Uh-huh.
and needless to say, they're still doing that,
They're still
making
doing
some
it
of the
today.
finest speakers ever built, and highly successful speakers and studio monitors,
Right.
and probably the most respected name in high-fidelity speakers.
Right.
And he started off over at the Baldwin Radio Factory building high-fidelity speakers
Oh, my goodness.
over there. So
Over there.
that's pretty cool.
It is.
And another employee who was also from the Fillmore area, he was actually born in Beaver, which
Okay.
is just down the
Just
road
down the road.
from Fillmore there. So this little community of about 1,000 people, and it produces these two guys. And the other guy, Philo T Farnsworth,
Okay, yes, that name is familiar.
invented television. And the really peculiar thing is he invented it long before going up to the factory. He invented it while he was in junior high
Oh, gee.
at the age of 14.
14. Mhm.
Yeah. And legend has it that he built his first successful television set in the radio
Right,
factory.
I've heard that.
Now, nobody knows for certain
We
if
don't know
that's
for
true,
sure,
but that's
but
the
I have heard
legend
that.
that's what happened. After the company went bust, he relocated to San Francisco,
Okay.
thinking that nobody was taking him seriously in the Salt Lake area. And so he went off to San Francisco and opened a manufacturing facility there, building the Philo Vision.
Okay.
The problem is, how do you watch TV when there are no TV stations? So there was kind of a whole thing about, how do you start up this whole industry?
Right.
And he got into a patent fight with RCA. He
Okay.
prevailed because his junior high school teacher saved one of the sketches that he'd made of his schematic of how the whole thing was going to work. So he was able to prove that, yes, in
Yes, I
fact,
did
he
invent that.
did invent the television at 14 years old. And RCA was forced to buy him out in order to produce their television set. And so he just kind of went off on his own and watched television develop from there. Kind of an interesting aside, years later they asked him what he thought of his invention after all of these years and what it had become. And he said the programming was incredibly stupid and he would not allow one of the things in his house.
That's funny.
But he also said that it was the proudest day of his life
Exactly.
when they broadcast live television from the moon in
There it was.
1969.
Exactly.
So kind of a mixed bag.
Right.
Another thing that he did that not a lot of people know he did is many, many years later, two characters were walking in the same little canyon, Mill Creek Canyon,
Right.
where the amplified sounds had been heard years and years earlier. Pons and Fleischman from the University of Utah went for a hike in Mill Creek Canyon when they hit on the idea of cold fusion.
Okay.
And they bandied this idea about walking about in Mill Creek Canyon, and they needed some money to develop that. And what a lot of people don't know is a lot of that money came from Philo Farnsworth,
I see.
who really believed in their research, and so secretly funded building the cold fusion reactor in their basement.
Oh, wow.
And well, that whole piece of business is still very controversial
Of course.
to this day.
Of course.
So kind of an interesting closure there all around Mill Creek Canyon of all the strange things, all the strange things. Well, if you haven't been over to the channel, pop over to the channel, and while you're there, of course, you should subscribe.
Absolutely.
There's a link to the channel right down here, the little rocket logo, and that'll take you to the channel. Also, a blue button will be appearing right in here that says subscribe, and you can click on that. You will then be subscribed, and it will take you to the channel where you can look at the other brilliant Toy Man and the preceding 3 movies leading up to this one on the railroads of John Young.
Right.
So that's pretty cool.
It is cool.
And we're going to do more John Young because we're not even halfway to Park City yet. So we're going to continue on our trek up John Young's Railroad all the way to Park City in future episodes.
That's going to be fun.
Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet, and we hope you didn't find it boring.
No.
Because it's a really cool
It's
story.
really
when you get right
fascinating.
into it. And we'll see you here again in 1 week with some more significant screwing around. We'll see you then. Bye.
Bye.